Okay, I think while people are still signing on, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just delighted about today's webinar. So for those of you returning, welcome back. To those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. The intention of this format is to create a unique conversation space that matches scientific advances and management needs. And so these webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion that I will facilitate out of the chat and from the list of questions we've gotten beforehand. This is all about us, giving us a place to ask clumsy questions and to navigate through a space where the solutions are not obvious. I always start by telling you a little bit about why this topic at this time by these speakers. Even though it might be a little bit obvious for this one. Demand for data center storage is forecast to grow globally by about 10% a year till 2030. And the Mid-Atlantic region, especially like states like Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, is already a hub for data centers. I think Northern Virginia's Data Center Alley or Maryland's Quantum Project are just a few examples. And this region in particular could see a doubling of energy demand by 2030. But the impacts go far beyond carbon emissions. A data center's water use requirements can vary, but on average uses about 300,000 gallons of water per day to cool itself, which is the equivalent to the amount of water that about 100,000 homes use. Some data centers can use up to 5 million gallons of water per day, which is the water usage by a city about the size of Annapolis. And collectively, data centers rank in the top 10 of water-consuming industrial or commercial industries. The next generation of technology will only make these facilities thirstier as servers that run AI algorithms generate more heat. And yet, detailed information on the potential environmental impacts of proposed centers have been hard to come by, just as local communities are being asked to accept them. So what do these demands of data centers mean for the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and how can we balance impacts with demand? I think that the speakers that are here today are just the best experts poised to tell us. So Lauren Bridges has a comprehensive background in communications and business and researches the socio-technical, political, economic, and environmental politics of digital infrastructures. You can hear her voice in extensive writings and interviews. And it's a lovely voice. Julie Bolthouse complements Lauren's expertise, I think, perfectly. She has a broad background that really supports a holistic view of issues, and she helps local communities plan for a sustainable future by working with residents to form coalitions, establish action plans, and achieve positive outcomes. And so I will gracefully ask the speakers, I'll try to gracefully indicate to you when you're getting close to the time limit. And I appreciate your willingness to sort of abide by that so we have time for conversation. And if you're attending, feel free to put your name and affiliation in the chat. And I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Denise. I'm just going to share my slides, so just give me a moment. Can you see my slides? Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got a lot to get through. As Denise just gave a wonderful introduction to the broad issues, I'm going to give an overview of some key terms. And as you'll see in my presentation, and then it will be expanded in Julie's presentation, the politics of water, land, and energy are all intertwined when it comes to expansion of data centers and data center development. So when I'm going to be focusing this presentation on water, but as you'll see, it also directly speaks to land use issues and energy consumption and a whole host of other issues. So I'm going to briefly go over some key terms of the industry, some industry trends, some of the latest academic research, and then hopefully we'll get to some policy and paths forward. So in terms of key terms, these are terms that you'll see in the media, in environmental impact reports, and I just wanted to give an overview of some of the issues around these, and I'll delve into them in a little more detail. So there are two types of water consumption for data centers: direct usage, that's usage at the site of the data center, and then indirect usage, and that's usage of water used to produce energy or in other sections of the supply chain in manufacturing of semiconductors, computers, and hardware. There's also the issue of impacts to the watershed and water quality. So they're not directly related to the direct consumption of water, but more so how development impacts water quality. Then there's a few industry terms: water usage effectiveness and net water positive, which I think are important to pause on and to deconstruct briefly. So water usage effectiveness is an industry metric that's used to measure the efficiency of water usage in data centers, and it's a measure related to energy usage. So it basically measures how much water is used in relation to how much power is used. And while it's useful to have these measures, there's a lot of discrepancy in how these metrics are applied in industry. There's not a lot of transparency around how they're doing these calculations, which is also makes it difficult to compare across different sites and across different providers. It also overlooks a few really important factors, and one of those is how it doesn't account for threats to the water source, water quality of a region. It also doesn't take into account old equipment, which might actually mean that the water usage is less, or the ratio is less because equipment's using more power. So it can hide certain things and other trade-offs in terms of power usage. So it is a useful metric in some circumstances, but it also obscures a lot in its calculation. And so we also need to ask follow-up questions, especially from industry providers when they're providing us with these terms or with these metrics. And then the other important industry term that's being used is net water positive. And essentially this means putting more water back into a water source than they've consumed. But again, a key concern here is that water is often drawn from one water source, often in water stressed regions, and then water is put back somewhere else. And so while there might be a net balance, which would put data center operators in the positive, we also have to be cautious in celebrating those moves when it's impacting specific areas. Okay, so data center global capacity is just growing. It's been growing for the last 10 or 15 years, but it's really taken off with AI since 2022, when the world woke up to ChatGPT. Data center development and growth has just been going gangbusters. So data center power consumption is expected to grow from 1 to 2% to 3 to 4% by 2030. And along with it, carbon dioxide emissions are also estimated to more than double by 2030. According to this recent Goldman Sachs report, ChatGPT queries use nearly 10 times as much electricity as a Google search. And they estimate that data center power demand will grow 160% by 2030. But The International Energy Association forecasts that data centers' electricity consumption will reach more than 1,000 terawatt hours by 2026. And this is ahead of the Goldman Sachs estimate. I want to highlight this discrepancy because there's a lot of competing numbers out there, and it is really difficult to get accurate estimates on how much power consumption and water consumption is expected by data centers in the coming years. But what we do know for sure is that it's increasing at a rapid pace. So part of the thing driving the power consumption, part of the demand is coming specifically from AI workloads and graphic processing units, or GPUs, the chips used in AI, as they use a whole lot more power than previous traditional processors. So this is leading to all kinds of power capacity issues and trade-offs in local communities when grids reach capacity. And we're seeing that around the world. For example, in West London, a moratorium was placed on new housing developments because data centers had already secured the electric grid allocations for the next 10 years or so. Similarly, in Norway, there was a case when a defense company was unable to expand due to a TikTok data center having already secured the local power, and the defense company were providing munitions to Ukraine. And this is also leading to moratoriums all around the world, the Netherlands, Singapore, Ireland, etc. And then we've also seen issues in Northern Virginia, where Dominion Energy put a pause on new power connections, and then also aired a potential policy to relax diesel emissions to allow data center operators to run diesel backup generators 24 hours a day. Although they put that, they shelved that policy after a lot of community pushback. But policies like that are going to continue to come up as local electric grids are reaching capacity. So despite all of these local trade-offs and grid capacity concerns, Cushman & Wakefield, a global commercial real estate agent, they actually they discussed that larger capacity markets actually represent lower risk profiles to data center operators. This is why data center operators and developers become attracted to certain areas, because there's a proven track record of companies working with local governments. There's access to high-skilled labor and access to fiber. So there's kind of a network effect that happens with certain markets where some operators come and then more decide to join. In Virginia, in particular, Dominion Energy predicts that by 2035, Virginia will require 11,000 megawatts, or nearly quadruple what it needed in 2022, or enough to power around 8.8 million homes. So water consumption and power consumption share a somewhat linear relationship at the moment, and that's because water is still the cheapest way to cool servers. It's cheaper than using electricity in air conditioners. So globally, data centers are forecast to consume 450 million gallons of water daily by 2030. And this is up from 205 million in 2016. It's estimated that 75 to 90% of data centers in the world use water as their primary source of cooling. And it's estimated that 80 to 90% of water is consumed from watersheds, such as lakes and ancient aquifers. Part of the concern around data centers is around transparency. Currently, there are estimates that only 39% of data centers are actually measuring their water usage, so this is a big concern for us. Data centers, as I mentioned, use water in two ways, directly and indirectly. Directly, a typical data center can use up to 5 million gallons of water per day. And while some data centers are using grey water or reclaimed water, many still rely on potable water. But direct water consumption actually only represents 1/4 of all water consumption for data centers. The rest of it, 75% of it, is consumed from energy usage or from energy production. And that's also not even taking into account water used in the tech supply chain, in the production processes of manufacturing silicon chips that go into, the hardware that goes into data centers. And the problem is that a lot of this water is being drawn, or approximately 1/5 is being drawn from regions with moderate to high water stress. And this is creating further strain on communities where water is scarce. So data centers also pose risks to the water source, and this is because they're often being located in greenfield sites or in agricultural and farmland where they're actually paving over open lands, which increases runoff and increases the risk of both flooding, erosion, and impacts water quality. All of this water usage is increasing with the intensity of the AI boom. A recent study published in 2021 estimated that a single ChatGPT request consumes the equivalent of a 500 ml bottle of water. But just a week ago, the authors of that paper adjusted their estimates because it was based on ChatGPT from 2020. And so now they're saying that it's going to be at least 4 times higher than what they first estimated. So industry solutions to the problems range from dropping data centers into the sea to use ambient seawater to cool data centers. For example, with Project Natic, which was run by Microsoft. In another example, Google uses seawater in Finland to cool its servers. There's also immersion cooling, which submerges servers into non-conductive liquid. But this requires substantial server modification, and it's still quite expensive. So it hasn't been widely taken up by the industry. I'm going to try to wrap up here. I'll just go through a few other industry trends. So there's also closed loop systems, which does not require refilling water, but it does still have some evaporation. But it does mean less water is drawn from local water sources. And then there's direct-to-chip cooling. And this, again, poses a high cost and also a high risk, even though it basically directly cools AI chips. Again, with a non-conductive fluid. But this can significantly lower both water usage and power usage in data centers. And then there's ambient cooling techniques of putting data centers into bunkers, underground, into mountains, etc. And there's ways to recycle the waste heat from data centers through district heating, which we're seeing in the Nordic countries. To this example of a public swimming pool in the UK that was heated by a local server. So I'm just going to try to wrap up, but essentially the grid capacity concerns are going to intersect with water as data center operators are looking to nuclear now. There's the reopening of 3 Mile Island and small nuclear reactors. Data center operators are also turning to gas. Both nuclear and gas use a lot of water. And there are impacts to local water sources, thermal pollution, beyond concerns around toxic waste. Mm-hmm. And there's also the delayed coal. So this is also happening in Maryland, in Virginia, in West Virginia, in Wisconsin, Utah, Georgia, etc. So the intersection of both energy capacity concerns and water is going to be a continued and ongoing issue. I'm going to wrap up there, and we'll see how we go in the Q&A. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lauren. And we'll just transition to Julie.
Great, thank you very much. And a lot of what Lauren has gone over, I think will hopefully fit really well into what I'm going to cover, which is more local in nature. So I'm going to be focusing in on Virginia. That did not work. Sorry. Give me 1 second. There we go. Slideshow. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, you're good,
Okay.
Julie.
Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to be covering is the state development trends and energy plans, and then land use impacts of data center development in Virginia, and just some recommended best practices at the local and state level. So first, going to go into what has been proposed by our utility. Our local utility here is Dominion. And the energy projections that we're looking at are unprecedented. So if you see the gray line there in the graph, that's the electric usage since 1995. It has increased a little bit, but nothing like what we're projecting is going to happen in the next 15 years or so. They are projecting 23 gigawatts worth of growth, which is a doubling of our existing 22, which is almost 23 at this point, gigawatt capacity. This is because of all the data center growth that's been in our region. There's some, increase that's coming from electrification of things. A lot of that is actually offset by energy efficiencies that have been gained over time, switching to LED light bulbs and more efficient appliances and things like that. The vast majority is coming from data center energy needs. And this is a graph that PEC has put together of all the data center development that we're aware of in our region. This is kind of a crowdsourced graph. That being said, though, when we get data, we confirm that data on the county websites using their land use tracking systems, and make sure there is an actual application in the pipeline for that data center. Vast majority of these, so the pink dots are ones that are already existing. So this is data centers that are already existing. The red ones are ones that are mostly approved, but are not built yet. Some of them are in the pipeline and are up for consideration. So the background data using the Excel spreadsheets that go into that map, what we've been able to quantify is that there's 180 million square feet of data center development in the pipeline. There's about 50 million square feet that is already built or under construction. So we're talking about in addition to that, 180 million square feet. That's equivalent to 1,000 Walmart supercenters, just for scale. And a lot of that is already approved, as I said. So let's just real quickly go over, and I have a whole hour-long presentation on this if you want more information about the land use impacts of data centers. I gave a webinar to the American Planning Association, and that's available online. The Virginia American Planning Association, our chapter here in Virginia. So you can check out that. But this is the list of land use impacts that generally I encourage localities to think about when they're considering data centers. So obviously, there's traffic and there's, lighting and noise, the typical things that you would expect. But there's also a lot of things that are oftentimes not thought about completely. And we're going to go into a couple of those highlights that I think are most important and most interesting. Compatibility with adjacent land uses. So this is a picture of Loudoun County showing Ashburn in the foreground and the data center alley. And you can see some of the cranes up in the air building new data centers just beyond it. And we started to see a lot of conflicts from that development. And that's because these data centers, these hyperscale data centers, are industrial uses. Back in 1990, when we first started building data centers in Loudoun County, they were a very different animal. They were integrated into business parks. They were much smaller, 10,000 square foot, not that huge of facilities, didn't have the energy demands that they currently have, didn't have, they had generators, but they didn't have hundreds of generators. They didn't have on-site power generation. They didn't have a substation for every campus. And that's what we're looking at now. So data centers are very different than they were. The compatibility issues that we run into that I think localities should be aware of is connectivity. So these are huge facilities. They have fencing and security, and that hinders, your trail connections plans, your road plans and everything if you don't think about it proactively. Electrical infrastructure, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to get to the site, and that infrastructure is permitted through the SCC, which has the ability to use eminent domain to route those transmission lines. So once a locality approves a development, even if they didn't consider energy, which most of them do not consider energy in their analysis, those transmission lines are still necessary and they're still going to be permitted through the SCC, and the locality does not have much control over that aspect. Increased land prices. These prices start to go up as there's speculation for more data center development. We're looking at $3 million an acre here in Virginia. And so that has priced out a lot of other types of uses that we would like to see mixing into our economic development portfolio. Induced demand. Once you get a lot of data centers, there's push for more data centers because all the things that Lauren explained, but also data has value, and these data centers are not working independently. They're oftentimes connected to each other and sharing that data. And so, access to each other is also a valuable component. And then complementary uses I would describe as energy generation, industrial, office flex, and incompatible uses are things like residential, parks, trails, mixed use development, commercial tourism, and agriculture, especially agritourism. This is just a map that shows, again, the data center development in Loudoun County specifically. So the yellow triangles are existing data centers. Again, a much smaller animal. Most of those little triangles are like 20,000 square feet. They're much smaller. The red triangles are the new data center proposals that are in the pipeline. Those are usually 200,000 square feet or larger. They're much larger. So this doesn't really give you scale. The red line going around the area is the new 500 kV transmission line that needs to be plowed through the community, and that's causing a lot of opposition. This is, again, just the routes, the new transmission lines that need to be built to serve all the load growth in Northern Virginia. The red dots are the new data center development. The brown is expansion of existing right-of-way for transmission lines. The red lines are new transmission lines that are necessary, and the purple is wreck and rebuild. There's also a new round of proposals in the pipeline for 765s. This will be the largest transmission line in our region that needs to serve the area. And you add that all together and you start to see that that's just expanding upon what was already approved in 2023. And it's going again to those coal facilities that Lauren mentioned. So now with this new proposal is going to connect up to John Ammo's coal power plant directly. Now, the backup generators, I want to real quickly get into that, and then I'm probably out of time. These generators are huge. There's a whole lot of them. We've got 4,000 piled up and permitted in Loudoun County. That's a huge air quality risk because those are in very close proximity to residential development and parks. We also have not just diesel generators, which are used for the backup power for the facility, but we also have new on-site natural gas turbines that are coming online. And that's to try to get power for the facilities because they can't get it from the grid. The grid is maxed out and they're waiting for all those transmission lines I just showed you. And so in the meantime, they're trying to use natural gas turbines to help meet that need. Now, question I always get, what about the solar panels? Why don't we have solar panels on the roof? I don't know the answer to that. All I can tell you is that I've been told by the industry it's not worth it. The rate of return isn't there. So this one beautiful data center in New Jersey is a picture I could find, but we don't have any, as far as I know, in Loudoun or in Virginia on data centers. And the water usage. Like Lauren said, we don't have very much information about water on the larger scale, but what we were able to do is FOIA for the water usage within Loudoun County in that area of Data Center Alley. And what we found was alarming, and that's that the water usage, it used to be mostly using the reclaimed water system. Well, it's gone well beyond that. And now the potable water system surpasses the reclaimed use, and the usage for that is up 250% in the last 4 years from 2019 to 2023. Also, that data center development is highly concentrated in certain watersheds. So this is just a picture of the Broad Run watershed going into the Potomac. And you can see how concentrated that is in that single watershed. And that has huge impacts on the, base flow, groundwater recharge, because these are huge facilities. They have big buildings, large parking lots, they've got their generator storage yards, they've got their power generation facilities, got substations associated with them. So huge impacts on the watershed. So a couple of recommendations. A lot of localities have these what I call blob plans, which does not give you enough information to actually adequately protect public health, safety, and welfare. You need details. You need to know this level of detail before approving any kind of data center development. You know where the roads are going to be, where the parking lots, where the generators are going to be. Are they facing inward? Are they, outward facing? Where is the substation going to be? Is there land reserved for transmission lines? That sort of stuff needs to be answered. And this is a couple recommendations for localities. We need to require SUPs because this industry is changing so rapidly. Like I said, we've gone from 10,000 square foot to 500,000 square foot. We now have on-site power generation where we never had that before. A data center would never even have dreamed of putting natural gas on their site before, and now that's where we are. You need to have definitions for your data centers. Make sure that if you just want data centers and you don't want on-site power generation like natural gas, specify that. Adopt specific requirements for detailed general concept plans and make it clear to elected officials that the utility has to provide power. If you approve it, the power has to get there some way. At the state level, we need to have better planning, monitoring, greater transparency. The impacts need to be fully understood, and we need to have improved standards and innovation. The industry needs to pay their fair share, and we need to mitigate the impacts. Our goal, and this is my last slide, our goal at the General Assembly this year is to increase transparency, disclosure of energy, water, and emissions, and state oversight, have additional review of energy and regional impacts in addition to those local standards that we need to have in place. And then growth needs to pay for growth. We need to have a full evaluation of the infrastructure costs and adjust the rates accordingly. And so that risk of all this infrastructure build out is not falling onto the residential ratepayer or other businesses, is actually on the data centers. Oh, that's my alarm. I'm sorry. And then restricting the state tax credit to only data centers that serve as demonstrations of the highest level of sustainability. So that's all I have. And I'm sorry, I know I went a little bit over.
You all did an excellent job. And I think the word that describes me right now is gobsmacked. Like I really had no idea. Maybe one of the first questions is that, the tension between, demand and impacts seems to be really concentrated at the local level, versus, I don't know, state, federal. So where's the kind of largest point of pain where we need to focus our efforts to play catch up, basically, right? So I'll ask Julie first, because I think you just talked about that, and then Lauren, you can add.
I think that it really is all levels of government, but it's a different amount of, I guess, action needed at each level. So at the federal level, I would say we need to have transparency standards in place, similar to what the EU has. The EU adopted the EU Energy Efficiency Directive, and that required reporting from data centers on their energy use, their water usage, their PUEs, their WUE, all that information so that they could establish better standards and so that they'd have more information about what's going on. At the state level, though, we need more than just that. We need ratepayer protections as well. And we also need to have some oversight of what the localities are doing. And at the local level, we need the localities to start to be aware of these secondary impacts that are going to come down the line. The problem right now is we have a geographic disparity and a temporal disparity. And so the impacts are coming later after they've approved, like 4 years later. So, politically it's not as impactful, when you make the decision and you promise all the revenue when the impacts come 4 years later. And then same thing with the geographic impacts. A lot of times we're talking about transmission lines that are out in other states sometimes, not even, some of them will be local, but many of them will actually not be local.
Mm.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think Julie's nailed it, that intervention needs to happen at multiple different levels and it all needs to be working in coalition with one another. One of the issues that think we spoke about in the talk before today, is that there aren't regional planning bodies that are looking at the cumulative effects of all of these developments. There are regional industry bodies that are lobbying for this kind of growth, but there isn't an equivalent looking at how development in one county, for example, impacts other counties. I mean, in Prince William County, there was, the huge digital gateway project that was approved, and in the process of that, Fairfax County, which sits adjacent to Prince William, their water authority sent Prince William County planners a letter saying, please look at the cumulative impacts because our residents rely on this same water source. And that's part of the problem, is that there are jurisdictional boundaries, and the development approvals or land use rezoning or special use permits are happening in the local level. They're happening in local counties, and they have impacts that go beyond that county. They go to the surrounding counties that are reliant on the same water sources because we're all part of the same, we have the same environmental commons. And they also impact, the extraction and production of energy, where waste goes, all kinds of things. So I think part of the challenge is that that approvals are happening at the county level when there are impacts that extend beyond that.
And I'll just throw in one last thing that I forgot to mention, which is also at the federal level, there's a ton of subsidies that are going into building out this power. And there's not enough question as to why are we doing that? Like, obviously, we want to have incentives for a transition to renewable energy. And I think that somehow got mixed up in the thinking. And we're using those same incentives to now just build out explosive amounts of nuclear and other things. So I think that's another part.
And I'll just also bounce off that to say that a lot of the investments, I mean, Amazon, for example, who has announced a $35 billion investment in Virginia alone, they also tout themselves as the largest private investor in renewable energy. This is creating other concerns around equity of access to the energy transition. If data center operators are going to go ahead and invest and bankroll big renewable energy projects, but they're going to buy up all of the power, that's not going to actually solve our problems. It's not going to solve the problems of power needed for other productive activities. Instead, it's going to create a private sector for renewable energy, and it's going to mean that renewable power is already allocated to big cloud companies. So yeah, I agree that sometimes the incentives might actually be counterproductive in the way that they are used.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dimension. I hadn't really thought about the equity part of that. I'm going to go to a little bit of a more specific technical question. Someone had asked really early about what is actually the temperature delta for cooling water after it's utilized in a facility, and then what is there about any sort of protocol for where that heated water goes. So in the scope of, for example, working on trying to make a differentiation in the Chesapeake Bay watershed between, heating and cooling best management practices, right? And now our attention to temperature as much as anything else associated with water. So do you have technical information on how big that issue is, the warming issue? And what kind of controls are in place for once that heated water leaves the facility?
I don't have specific figures in front of me. How about you, Julie?
No, I don't have any specific figures. I mean, a lot of the water is going to a wastewater treatment facility if it's in a more urban area like Loudoun County. I honestly, I don't know of any that are discharging to an actual water body. There probably is somewhere out there, but not that I know of.
Yeah, I don't know any specific cases of them, discharging to specific water bodies.
And I would say one of the biggest things about data centers is that their water usage is consumptive. A lot of it is evaporated out. And so it's not going anywhere else. But I actually, what I thought you were getting at was heat recapture and trying to utilize that heat. And what I understand from just data center conferences that I've attended is that the heat recapture is real. That can definitely happen, like the image you showed of the pool. It could also be used in agriculture. There's a lot of possibilities, but the problem is it's low quality heat. And so it's difficult to utilize. You have to enhance it, or I'm not an engineer, so I don't know, but there's challenges to it. And then the other thing is, in the United States, because of our sprawling land use patterns, we don't have a good system in place of distributing that heat like they do in some places where it's been used, like in Amsterdam and Germany, and so that's a challenge as well.
That leads really into another question, which is, what about the impacts? Can you sort of compare and contrast the impacts between data centers in urban versus rural areas? And I think
Yeah.
you just touched on that, Julie.
Yeah, and actually, that was part of the reason I really wanted to include that compatibility slide, is because I think it's really important to understand it's not, we're in a situation where data centers do not really belong in either one of those environments. So it really has to be industrial because they are an industrial use now. They're becoming like a manufacturing facility. And so you don't really want that in an urban area because of the health impacts, the noise impacts, and everything else that it has on the adjacent neighborhoods. But you don't really want it out in your rural areas either because it has all the infrastructure that is required with it. So it needs water, it needs a wastewater system, it needs electric transmission. You don't really want to be plowing that through agricultural fields and hurting agritourism and other things. So it's very challenging where you cite them, but I would say industrial areas, what seems the most attractive to me as a planner is places like the Rust Belt, where you already have manufacturing facilities that are no longer in use. Like there's a bunch of abandoned factories in the Rust Belt that could be revitalized and turned into data centers. I think that's probably, from a land use perspective, the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that at the moment, the developers and the data center operators are the ones dictating the terms. They're the ones telling planners, this is how much land we need. We need this giant, like hyperscale size plot. Otherwise, we're not coming to your county. And I think some local planners are getting bullied, quite frankly, into accepting that either they're going to get these tax dollars, they're either going to get this investment, or they're going to go elsewhere. And I think we really need to question that and push back because, as Julie rightly points out, there are other places, and industrial areas are definitely, the places that we should be looking and revitalizing industrial areas. But quite frankly, I think that the fact that agricultural and open lands and rural lands are being made available for data centers, it's much cheaper for them. It means that they can just pave over open lands and develop. We know that they prefer greenfield sites over brownfield sites. I noticed in the chat, Brandon Hill made a comment about Frederick County. And yeah, I had just, for this talk, looked up what was happening. And I see that there was a 20,000 acre area being disputed, the Sugarloaf Treasured Landscape. And it's an open farmland area, and county planners have decided to reject any development limits in the in the region for like protecting that particular rural area. And we're seeing this time and time again across the United States. So I think part of the problem is that the developers are dictating the terms when we should be the ones telling them where they can and can't go.
Well, and there was a really wonderful in the chat. And again, thank you, everyone, because the questions beforehand were great and the ones in the chat are fantastic. And just to remind you that if we didn't get to the question you posed, we do follow up with the speakers and try to get answers to everything. And that'll come out after a couple days after this webinar. So everyone will get a chance, but thank you. There's a wonderful kind of follow-up. And And the question is there any type of government regulation on industry currently or being considered to force industry to an evaluation of data needs, which are necessary and what could we do without? Which kind of follows up on a comment I think you made, Julie, about like, we're not even asking, do we need all this? We're not having a conversation about that. And then I think Lauren's comments point out that then at the next step, we're not even challenging what the data center developer is telling us that they need. So at what point is there any potential sort of places where that conversation can take place, both about these needs for the facilities overall, and then once they're proposed, is there any sort of flexibility in what they're asking for?
So I would be cautious in opening up a conversation with industry to let them dictate or tell us what they need, because we know that data center demand has been increasing, particularly around the commercial application of AI. So I think, yeah, do we need these data centers? Industry will tell us yes. But if I think community members, organizers, policymakers gather together to slow the process or ask more questions, make data center operators and developers accountable for their impacts and reporting on their impacts, then I think it might make developers question, like whether or not it's going to be a viable investment for them. So yeah, I think I would be cautious in engaging industry, because we do know that demand has been increasing. It's just more a question about each community deciding what they want to invest in for the future. This could also be a boom and bust situation with AI, although we don't, it's not looking like it at the moment.
And I will say, just as you were speaking, the little note turned up on my thing that actually using AI, right, to transcribe the notes from this meeting. So it's just sort of ironic, right? So, Julie?
Yeah, I would just add also that the demand is increasing, but there is a lot of questions around, how much of that demand is real, and, how much we might be surpassing the demand with the infrastructure that we're building out to meet it, because there's such a race and things are moving so fast. And there's a little bit of assumption, I think, at the political levels, like with our legislators, our decision makers, that the tech industry will figure this out, that they know what they're doing. And there's a little bit of like, we're all kind of starstruck by like how amazing, Elon Musk is, and, Jeff Bezos and all the amazing things that they've done, that we're just kind of deferring to their innovation to solve everything. And I think what localities and our government agencies really need to start doing is stepping back and thinking about, what is my role as the agency? What is my role as the locality? And it's to protect public health, safety, and welfare. It's to ensure that our water it depends on the agency, obviously, but, like, let's just say EPA, it's to protect the water, it's to protect the air, it's to protect public health. And then move from that position to what needs to be done. And the reason I say that is because think about the car. Think about how the automobile came out there. It had no seat belts. The emissions were terrible. There was all sorts of disgusting things that were spewed from the original car. And it was not because, people just changed their behavior and stopped driving cars that the air got cleaned up. It was because there were standards put in at the highest levels by regulatory agencies that were protecting public air and public health. They weren't making decisions based on the technical needs of the car and people need to go places. No, they said, okay, that's great. You want to make a car and people need to go places. My job as the agency is to protect the air quality and the public health. Therefore, these are the standards that we're going to put in place, and you company have to figure out how to meet it. And they did. They figured it out. And that's what we need to do with data centers. We need to say, okay, here's the standards. The energy demand you have on the grid is just unattainable. Figure it out. and come back to us when you got something that's reasonable, because we can't just keep chasing this, growth. It's insane.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So let me ask you on the positive side, um, both from what we've already learned, because there was a question in the chat about, can't we apply, for example, what we've learned about stormwater, right? Effective control of stormwater. What are lessons learned that we can apply to this issue? And then what's necessary, or what are promising policies that are being considered, that can kind of assist us? So more on the, potential side. What are things that are going on right now? And I think you both mentioned some of them. So maybe, Lauren, do you have any sort of policies on the horizon that can help, or lessons learned, things we've learned from other issues?
Yeah, so in terms of policy, at the moment, I mean, there's a lot of policies being proposed, mostly around doing reviews of the environmental and energy impacts or impacts to grids. But we also need to pair that with more transparency, which is, I think, something that Julie's been championing it in her talk. So we need transparency, not just around these industry-led metrics, which can obscure lots of different things. We need transparency around actual usage, and constant updates, not just at a moment in time. We need to set benchmarks for acceptable usage. Then we need some enforcement for what happens if power and water usage goes over that. There needs to be incentives for alternate cooling technologies to develop, some of these other technologies that I described, like immersion cooling, direct to chip cooling, using the heat, although as Julie mentioned, it is low quality heat, and I have also heard that it's not hot enough, or it's not the excess heat isn't enough to actually redirect, unless you have the infrastructure to do that for district heating, like they do in certain other places, like in Nordic countries. There needs to be monitoring and auditing. We also need to require companies that are reporting on net zero water policies, or their net zero impacts, to actually consider the water sources they're drawing from and the water sources they're giving back to. There also needs to be more studies on water quality, not just water consumption, and considering impacts to water stressed regions. In terms of promising policies, the most common policies that I'm seeing at the moment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Julie, are moratoriums. And that's really a stopgap measure. That's like a pause, because this growth is happening so quickly. It's a moment to check in and to do the appropriate reviews to understand what the impacts are. And moratoriums are being used to, pause developments for data centers, to pause new power connections. But they're really only a stopgap measure. We really need to push increased transparency, and looking at these regional cumulative impacts from development, rather than looking at or reviewing each new development on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
So I would agree 100%. And I would say the most promising thing that I see on the horizon right now is, okay, this is going to sound really crazy coming from an environmentalist that's been fighting with Dominion for, a decade, but some of the proposals coming out of the utilities, and specifically, the one I'm talking about is Ohio AEP. They have a proposal right now to enhance their contracts with these large energy users, to require them to pay a larger percentage up from the beginning, 90% instead of 70%, and not as much, not a ramp up period. And also a longer contract period. So they'd be paying that for 10 years. They have to prove solvency that they can pay it. And the reason I think all of that is important is because it forces facts into the conversation. conversation so that we're not just speculating, we're not potentially chasing a bubble. And I think that if the other utilities start to require that kind of upfront payment system and make the industry pay for all this infrastructure, that actually has positive impacts on the environment as well. Because now that they're having to pay for their infrastructure, they have to slow down. And when they have to slow down, they have to be more energy efficient. All of a sudden, we're able to catch up on a lot of the sustainability standards we'd like to see get into place. So I think that's the most positive thing I see on the horizon. The other thing that I think is really positive is just awareness. People are growing more and more aware of this issue. Now, when I say that I have been working on data centers for the last 3 years, people know what a data center is. That's like amazing, and I think people are also starting to ask really good questions of their elected officials when these proposals are coming through. So I think that's all positive. There is some positive stuff going.
This time is flying by. It's probably a last question, and well, I'll combine two, but do you have advice for communicating both the burdens and benefits of data centers to the public and decision makers? And I kind of goes on to your last comment, Julie, about getting the conversation going. But what do you think do you have any advice, for people that are interested in communicating this information? And then I'll also ask you each to sort of combine that with, a parting thought, because you both presented a lot. But if you sort of have one thing you want to make sure people leave with, what might it be? And Julie, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I would just say there's a lot of great resources out there. So if you go to PEC's website, we've got an 8-minute video. We've got maps. We've got a couple good articles that are a real quick read. There's just tons of information out there about this issue. And sharing that information is I think the most effective way of helping our elected officials make better decisions. And I would encourage everyone to, write your elected officials. And if you are an elected official, research this issue more and find out more about it. And I also encourage all the academic institutions to dig into the data, because that's where this really, that's where I think we can make some real progress, is digging into that data and asking really good questions.
And your parting thought?
That is my parting thought.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Just making sure. All right, Lauren.
Yeah, I think I'm probably gonna repeat some of what Julie has already said. There are so many resources out there every day. I'm getting Google alerts that, there's a new article that's published. The Washington Post has some really excellent reporting that they've been doing on particularly the power grab for data centers. There's just wonderful journalism happening around this issue. Yeah, the PEC website is an invaluable source for my research and for information on these issues. I also did an educational video on data centers, now a few years old, from 2021, which kind of brings up the general overview of some of the issues, but I feel like now it's already dated because so much has changed, and AI has really increased and intensified the growth of data center demand. And then in terms of a parting thought, I would also really encourage people to look at what's happening in your local community. Look at what's happening in the county in which you live. Keep an eye on development projects. I mean, it looks like Maryland is being positioned for a potential data center growth market. So I'd expect to see more projects down the pike for Maryland and for the Northern Virginia area and the region. So keep an eye on it and attend planning meetings. You can read excellent reporting about these issues to get yourself educated about it. But attend planning meetings, be active in local politics. I think that's the best way forward.
Oh, I think that's an excellent ending note. So let's all get ourselves educated, go to our local planning commission, find out what's going on. I want to thank the speakers. You're wonderful. And I'd also really, really like to thank everyone who attended and submitted questions. And so look for the follow-up. Thanks again, and we will see you next month.
Thank you for having us.
Mhm.
Thanks so much, everyone.